Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Zarakol. So the first question is about the future of global order. So in your recent ideas letter essay, you note that in the early 1990s, scholars and experts alike offered forward-looking visions, not to mention the Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. But today's intellectuals seem unable to present what is coming next. So the question I like to pose in line with your argument is this: do you think genuinely new visions are most likely come from the non-Western side of the world? And relatedly, do you think such an emerging order will be pretty much novel one rather than a reformed or reshaped version of the existing one?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to talk to East Asia Institute. Um, yes, so the piece of writing you mentioned, I was making an argument that in the 1990s, when the Cold War came to an end, Western intellectuals seemed to have debatable but comprehensive visions about what was coming afterwards. So I discuss along with Fukuyama, you mentioned, who basically says nothing is coming because we're at the end of history. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis, and also Robert Kaplan. By contrast, I think now there's a pronounced anxiety, especially in the West, that what used to be called the liberal international order has ended or is ending. But there isn't really, apart from some maybe MAGA circles and maybe some tech broad sponsored philosophers, there isn't anybody who's saying this is what's coming next. There seems to be either like a desire to kind of, although this is decreasing day by day, like an attempt to salvage the liberal international order. We can fix this kind of backward looking vision, or reaching, further back into 20th century analogies about, World War II or the interwar period. So most of the frameworks Western intellectuals are operating with tend to be looking to the past rather than the future or what's coming next. That was the point I was making. And then I finished the essay by saying, if new visions are to come, they will more likely come from the non-West, because the non-West, what's called the global South wrongly, I think, because not everybody, like Korea is a good example. Not all non-Western countries are really, global South, what used to be called, the third world. But let's say non-West, they don't have the same emotional attachment to the liberal international order, even when they kind of benefited from it. And I think not having that emotional attachment is helpful when you're trying to think about what's next. It allows you to be more innovative.
Yeah, I agree with you on the point that non-Westerns are less emotionally attached to the LIO. But recently, as you noted, the anxiety, I think the David Lake and Thomas Risse and others put together some pieces on the LIO again. Is published in February, and they were
Yes.
emphasizing the resilience of the LIO, although there have been multiple times of crisis. They seem to be more wishful or hopeful for the coming back of or reshaping of the LIO to some extent. So I think there is a perception or emotional uh, distance between those who are still supporting the LIO and the rest of
Yeah.
the.
Well, I'm at least, well, I mean, they're right in this way. So institutions never disappear overnight. They're often repurposed by new regimes. I'm now writing this trade book that starts from the very beginning and comes to the present. And I was just writing about the Warring States period, the Qin and the Han, like in Chinese history. And, after each period kind of repurposes the institutions of the old order, even as they sometimes stand against it. I mean, that's just one example. I think it's generally true. So I have no doubt that many institutions, agreements, certainly the economic aspects, like the hegemony of the US dollar and so on, like many aspects of the liberal international order will prove to be resilient.
Mm.
What I'm skeptical about is whether they will continue to be used for liberal purposes or even ostensibly liberal purposes, because we could always debate whether the liberal international order was really liberal.
Mm.
But I think it's much more likely that now some of these institutions, alliances will be banned to illiberal purposes and in service of American maybe empire building 2.0.
So some of the features or some aspects, like economic aspects of the international order may remain, but the purpose of the order may
Yeah,
be not so that liberal as it used to be.
exactly. So what is resilient?
Yeah.
Is it the ideas that are resilient, or is it some of the agreements, alliances, institutions?
Yeah. Great. I will move on to the second question. It's about U.S.-Iran or U.S.-Israel-Iran war
Mhm.
conflict as a stress test of the emerging order. So this ongoing conflict among U.S., Israel, Iran appears to have demonstrated either disorder or unorder you differentiated, and you can clarify that distinction
Mm.
as you apply that framework. And the current conflict seems to be compressed many fault lines you have written about, including the unraveling of the post-1945 order, the loss of Western normative authority, the agency of non-Western actors, and the question of who gets to write the rules. So from a longer perspective, what do you think this conflict reveals about the actual structure of the emerging order? And once the immediate dust settles, whatever the military or diplomatic
Mm.
outcome, what do you expect to be the more durable consequences of this conflict for the international order or disorder or unorder going forward?
Yeah, thank you. So the disorder unorder distinction is not my own. Mark Leonard, who's the head of the European Council of Foreign Relations, has a new book out on unorder.
Mhm.
And I think the distinction that he's making is we have order, then we have disorder when the memory of the order and the expectations and so on are still in place. So what's happening seems disorderly because we have all these expectations about how order should work. And then there comes a point where basically there is no order. It's not even disorder. It's just, there's no new order has been created. And I think it's a helpful distinction. I mean, I disagree with him as I don't think we're there yet. Historically, there have certainly been periods where uh, things really fell apart. Like, I mean, you can go to antiquity, to West Asia, the Bronze Age collapse, and
Mhm.
for about 100 years, there's some of the cultural elements persist, and then it's kind of the archaeological record is blank, so that would be probably disorder or unorder. I think we're still in a period of disorder, and what that I define as I say, like so, we have ideas about how things should work. We have expectations that there should be one international order. We still have people, as you mentioned, like Lake and Risse and so on, who say the order is still here. Others say, no, it's over. So there's no consensus. It's fragmentation. And, um, quite transactional. Um, Middle powers are hedging. Others are trying to, plot the course of the next order. Yeah, so it's for me that is disorder. It's not exactly chaos, but the consensus has broken down, and some are still in the in the past. Others anyway. So and I think the Hormuz Strait situation or the Iran-Israel US war is a good example of that. We've been kind of living with it for. Um, 2 months now. But it's almost, again, like fallen off headlines almost. I mean, it's actually something that, by all accounts, is going to cause, severe energy crisis, and it is already in Asia. It's already having these effects. It's where I live, the UK is predicted to have major like jet fuel shortage this summer. Maybe affecting
Mhm.
travel and so on. Like to that extent. At the same time, attention has kind of moved on. It's kind of there. It's become like kind of part of the landscape as Gaza has and Ukraine has, and they're major conflicts, but it's kind of a fragmented. Nobody can pay attention to them all, so people have their pet kind of conflict that they're following if they're being directly affected by it, and we kind of exist in this situation of are the straits closed? Are they open? Nobody can kind of follow it day by day unless they're like really on top of it. And for me, that is, the very definition of disorder. And I suspect that this situation will persist for some time. I don't think we're going to, again, recreate some kind of consensus or kind of a new order anytime soon. As we go, we'll likely add more conflicts to this fragmented landscape. And everybody will kind of have to figure out for themselves and their own countries how they survive in this kind of messy world.
So I'm not sure you have read the short Council of Councils Global memo I and President John have written.
Mhm.
So there we argue that we are in the state of a hybrid unstable order.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
completely
yeah,
agree with
yeah.
that.
This is not spheres of influence politics, great power politics, because they are not endorsing China's fierce influence in the Pacific
No,
or
no.
Russia's influence. So those are two different like organizing principles applied to different regions. So yeah, we also pretty much agree with your
Yeah, I
answer.
think people are trying to retrofit, these older concepts into what's
Yeah,
going on, but
yeah.
I don't think it really works. I agree.
The final question may matter a great deal to our audience here at the EII. In your NSI interview, you observed that countries used to dealing with unpredictability, those in the global south or in the non-Western area, are probably better prepared for this environment than many Western states. And in light of your statement, South Korea sits in an unusual position for a former periphery state that became one of the most successful beneficiaries of the post-Cold War liberal order, but whose geography puts it directly at the seam between US and Chinese organizing principles in the Indo-Pacific. From your vantage point and drawing on your work of stigma hierarchy and the agency of states that have historically been outsiders to Western defined orders, what would you say to a country like South Korea or other middle
Mhm.
power that are not being compelled to navigate this polycrisis or fragmentation of the order?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the arguments that I made in that interview, also in this disorder talk that I'm giving. I do think uh, countries like South Korea are well placed to deal with this, as I said, like this period of disorder that I suspect will be in for longer than we think. I mean, one of the comparisons that I make is in my last book, Before the West, which ends kind of in the 17th century, which is again a long period of disorder, and the that disorder disadvantages the old powers of the 16th century, which are primarily, Asian empires, like from Ottoman Empire to the Ming, but also the Habsburgs in Europe. And really, the winners, when all the dust has settled, are the up and coming smaller European states, like in Western Europe, England, France, and so on. So, I mean, of course, it's not an exact parallel, but I do think these periods of disorder are more advantageous for the non-status quo powers, like the more up and coming countries. So we may find that, in this competition between, US and China and Russia, like the older powers of, let's say, the 20th century, with structural pressures, AI, financialization, climate change, and so on. Because they're bigger countries, they have, they're stretched thinner, they have bigger challenges. And there may come a moment where like middle powers find themselves in a more advantageous situation. Especially countries like South Korea, as you say, a beneficiary of the old order, but not one of the top players, but materially in a good position to go into a period of disorder. At the same time, as we discussed, not having the same emotional attachments to so being more open, I suppose, to different strategies. Like, so for instance, Europe also has a lot of middle powers, but they are so attached to the 20th century order that they cannot really think outside of the box. So, I mean, none of this, it's going to be a tough time, no matter where you sit, periods of disorder. We all have to learn to live with high degrees of uncertainty and volatility and
Mm.
things changing rapidly. Uh, but I do think countries like South Korea are a better place
Okay.
to deal with this.
Yeah. I hope that South Korea could take advantage of the position we had enjoyed historically and politically. And although we are on the same side with Japan on some issues, but I also think that there's some difference between Japan and Korea in terms of how we approach the LIO and
Yeah.
how,
And there's nothing wrong with,
yeah,
recognizing the positive aspect, but at the same time, the world is moving on, so we all have to adjust.
yeah, that's
And how well you can adjust depends on how well you're able to let go of the past.
So the last question is about what mainstream are, I guess, right and wrong about the current issues or current status of the international order. One of the recurring threads in your pieces from after defeat through the before the West and your essays on essentialism trap is that mainstream IR theory, realism, liberalism, and even much of constructivism has been built on assumptions drawn from relatively narrow slice of Western European history, and that and this is becoming especially limiting is precisely at the moments like the present, and when the order those theories normalized is unwinding on or unraveling. So the questions are, where do mainstream art frameworks help and where do they mislead us in reading the pressing issues of our time, including those conflicts in Gaza, Iran, and Ukraine, and what concepts or starting points such as disorder or unorder would you put in their place?
Yeah, I mean, um, IR schools, if you're talking about, realism and liberalism, they are very, like, they're late 20th century forms of like very old ideas, that have existed not
Yeah.
only in the West, but also, in Eastern philosophy and so on. Or if you posit constructivism against like a kind of a materialism or empiricism, again, those are very old debates that like have existed as long as people have been around. What is the world made of? So I don't have a problem with the schools as such. It's just we shouldn't get trapped into their, late 20th century versions. We have to again update. And one of my arguments has always been if we know more history, especially if we know more than European history, we can update these theories
Mm.
for the 21st century.
Mm.
So that the 20th century versions had lots of blind spots. And when I was a graduate student, I mean, this is something I talk about in Before the West directly, but the the idea that the liberal international order could end or could fall apart, like nobody ever ever discussed it, like it was this teleology of ever expanding, Western order becoming universal international order. That kind of end of history thesis was also in IR theory. Um, we've already mentioned the spheres of influence stuff. Spheres of influence. People now look at, what Trump is doing, and then what China is doing. Like they try to read it through kind of a late 19th century spheres of influence. But these are not the European empires, and the world is not what it used to be. I mean, again, I don't have a problem with arguing, great powers compete. Of course they do. I mean, they always have in a way. But why do we need to read these
Mm,
through the lens of a very short period in history? Um, I mean, now there are many, many more sovereign states, actors. We've talked about middle powers. We just need to kind of broaden
mm,
uh, our horizons. Yeah, also even like this discussion that we've had about like long periods of disorder, there was no room for that in IR theory at the end of 20th century. Again, because not enough history has been studied.